Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Was there somebody there? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the History of Gardens and Landscapes seminar at the Institute of Historical Research in London. I'm Michael Ann Mullen, one of the co-hosts. Most of you know me by now. This is a continuation. This Springstrom seminars are a continuation of the theme. We're continuing the theme Gardens, Politics, and Power. And this is the second of the spring term seminars. I'd just like to, before we hear our speaker, I'd like to remind you to mute yourselves and to turn off your videos while the speaker is giving her paper. And you can turn them back on again at the end, after during the question time. However, we want you to write your questions as per usual. Type your questions into the chat box, and they will be relayed to our speaker afterwards. And then there'll be a time after the questions where everyone can have a chance to speak to the speaker and have an informal chat. So I think it's time now to introduce our speaker. Pippa, would you introduce Daria?
I'm delighted to introduce Daria Lynch, who's our speaker this evening. Daria is currently a PhD student at the University of York, where she's researching the history and spatial politics of migration in York, which might sound as though it's not connected to this evening, but I think there are very close connections with this topic she's talking about this evening, which is, as you can see on the screen, the spatial politics of the Schrebergarten, or allotment gardens in Germany. This is a subject that Daria has been working on for some time, because she started with an undergraduate thesis at the University of Rochester, which was entitled Gardeners into Germans, the Cultural Politics of the Schrebergarten from 1864 to 1939. And then she took that research forward with her master's at Oxford, where she looked at post-war Germany, and both the Germanys, and at the migrant involvement in those allotment gardens. So I don't think we could be in much better hands, Daria, to explore something that is rather a different approach to the theme of gardens, power and politics. Thank you so much for being here, and we're looking forward to hearing your paper.
Thank you for that great introduction. I'm very excited to be here. As Pippa said, this is a project that I've worked on for years, and it's been quite close to me because I grew up in my grandmother's allotment garden in Belarus. So I will, let's see if I can get this going. I will begin where my own curiosity began. In June 2016, the German branch of the European newspaper The Local published a short piece, "Berlin Colony Says No to More Non-Germans in Its Gardens." The article described recent incidents of denying Turkish families garden allotments in the Peace Colony in Berlin.
Cool, right, can I speak to you later?
Of keeping, quote, equilibrium in balance. Thus, a Muslim man's 2015 application for a garden was rejected on the basis that he was not German enough. This episode echoed another Turkish woman's experience whose application was similarly denied in 2013 because she too was not German. When she tried to dispute this by showing her German passport, she was told they meant she had to be German, not Turkish German. As one German Peace Colony gardener explained, Turkish families, quote, don't integrate themselves. They don't always go to the colony celebrations and don't always respect national holidays. These episodes suggest a peculiar cultural importance of these urban garden colonies that seem to be functioning as an institution central to understanding and enacting German national identity. Today, over 1 million gardens shape the urban landscape of all German cities, and the number is growing, suggesting this importance continues to increase. So what are these sites? These urban gardens are not exclusive to Berlin. If you travel into any German city by train, you'll stream by rows of small huts on individually separated green plots. These aren't campgrounds or slums, but Schrebergarten. These green spaces are German urban allotment gardens rented out to single families through Vereine or societies. It's not particularly exceptional that urban allotment gardens have influenced the German lifestyle and the German landscape, of course. Cities across the world are shaped by allotment gardens, but it is the extent to which they have been adopted and embraced by Germans of all ages and from all regions, how the gardens have come to represent Germanness and how they were first created, that is so intriguing. So in 1864, a group of Leipzig educators gathered together under the direction of educator Dr. Ernst Innozenz Hauschild to create a workers' education association they called the Schreberverein, or the Schreber Association. The purpose of this new organization was recorded in the appendix to an 1888 membership directory titled Zur freundlichen Beachtungen, or with friendly regards. The Schreberverein der Westvorstadt aims to continue the work of its founder, the faithful Dr. Ernst Hauschild, and the old Dr. Schreber in the lovely and healthy education of children. It hopes from its members that they will always remember the educational purpose of this association. The lovely and healthy education of children was apparently meant to be achieved through the Schrebergarten. The first Schrebergarten appeared at a critical time in German history. After decades of economic and social conflicts, events of the past century led to a rise in German nationalism, but economic difficulties delayed unification. Although political associations were banned in the Vormärz period, restless German citizens directed their frustrations towards political action. By 1848, up to 10% of men were organized in associations, and more than half were voting in national and state elections. But these associations did not only satisfy the nationalist aspirations of the middle class themselves. Through associations, middle-class members could project their ideals of proper German citizenship onto a wide audience and channel the energy of the working class in the direction required for the project of unification. Associations in this way followed the same disciplinary role as other 19th century institutions that Foucault identifies as central to the rise of the capitalist state: schools, hospitals, and prisons. In short, the bourgeoisie used organizational life to exercise control over the working class. Schrebergarten, shaped by bourgeois Vereine members, emerged as a repository of these values and virtues of the German middle class: purity, hard work, and nationalism. But the Schrebergarten also served as a means of middle-class control over a working class that had begun to organize and riot in their push for better labor and living conditions. As micro-farm plots, these spaces served as antidotes to the crisis of public health in the 19th century for German reformers who emphasized social causes of disease and turned to the natural environment for solutions. As such, these idealized values and the significance of the first Schreberverein are only understood through an examination of the new politics of public health in the 19th century and the body politics of Dr. Moritz Schreber, for whom the gardens are named. So, while the association and gardens are named after old Dr. Schreber, the man never created a garden himself, and his theories on children's education had a more physical than horticultural focus. Born in Leipzig in 1808, Dr. Schreber was a physician and pedagogue at the medical school of the University of Leipzig, and a controversial figure in German history. Schreber began his professional life as a scientist, focusing on the human body through developing sets of physical exercises he called medical indoor gymnastics. These routines, influenced by his engagement with the Turnen or gymnastics movement, eventually became a driving force behind his theories on education and lifestyle. Schreber's writing contributed to the growing field of literature on the body, both individual and national, reflecting the belief that gymnastics had effects on the mind as well as the body, forming characters or instilling appropriate moral values. He wrote close to 20 books covering both orthopedics and child rearing, reflecting his interest in the upbringing of children, physical culture, methodical bodybuilding through gymnastics, preventative medicine, school hygiene, and public health in order to, quote, rebuild degenerate national bodies and to develop a better and healthier race of men. Following the descriptions of 107 suggested exercises, Schreber concludes his book with exercise schedules for men, women, and children, noting in a rather paternalistic tone, there is not one which females may not execute with propriety and profit. Gymnastics and physical exercise were not reserved only for the German man, but should be embraced by every member of his family. Schreber expanded his theories on the body when he began advocating the use of correction devices. Schreber's devices were to be used on all middle-class children to ensure proper growth of upright citizens. Schreber insisted that the German nation was built around the family, and only through improving every member could the German nation be improved. In the last years of his life, Schreber focused his energies on espousing the benefits of green spaces for the health and sensibilities of working-class children. It was Schreber's belief that vigorous exercise in green spaces could fight the negative effects of growing up in a polluted, cramped urban ghetto. And as a city councilman in Leipzig, he argued for open exercise areas for children. Schreber never lived to see a Spielplatz or playground. Only by the end of 1864, 3 years after his death, had the Schreberverein created its first playground, naming it Schreberplatz. They had taken to heart Schreber's assertion in his most popular text, the Pangymnastikon, that, quote, a pure atmosphere is indispensable to health. The Schrebergarten was an extension of Schreber's ideas about body politics, founded on the use of physical exercise and labor in constructed and monitored spaces. These grounds were originally constructed to encourage the development of urban children through exercise and outdoor play, but soon the Schreberverein gained the reputation of promoting gardening and small animal husbandry. Created as spaces of subsistence farming for industrial workers, the gardens have always been urban or semi-urban spaces, located in industrial neighborhoods in major cities or along railway lines of towns, a sort of railway agriculture or Eisenbahnlandwirtschaft. The gardens provided an escape for workers and their families from city neighborhoods, perceived as unhealthy, to green spaces where they could grow their own produce, creating a pseudo-agrarian landscape where farming traditions could continue. The creation of these spaces matched the paternalistic trend of Schreber's own language as middle-class reformers led Schrebervereine with the intention of improving the livelihood of working-class families. Simultaneously, however, these gardens, being highly regulated, served as a tool to exercise control over a growing and restless working class. Plans of the gardens display the level of control Vereine members exercised over the worker gardeners' experiences in the spaces. One of the guiding principles of design in Schrebergarten colonies was to prevent gardeners from individualizing their gardens. Each gardener was required to divide their space into segments for vegetables and fruits, with each segment carefully measured out and tended. Each garden was to be lined with flower beds and bushes, suggesting that gardens were not simply spaces for subsistence farming, but were, quote, a true Eden, a place of recreation and adventure. Furthermore, each garden, as regulations stated, was to have a small structure that was also carefully described. The huts were to be solid and stable and, quote, may only be 1 story and not larger than 24 square meters. These regulations fulfilled 2 functions. With low structures dominating the landscape, the colony appeared homogeneous and orderly, but it was also open to supervision. Gardeners were explicitly forbidden from living in their rented plots, forcing workers to remain in their poor urban housing when not under supervision. Regulations of Schrebervereine stated that the garden owner was responsible for the careful use of the communal facilities, and that above all, every garden owner is expected to be particularly concerned with the constant maintenance of order and good manners on the Schreberplatz, the central communal space. While the division of the Schreberverein land into individual allotments might encourage an individualization amongst the so-called owners, this focus on the use of communal facilities and spaces reminded the worker that he did not own the land, but rather was being permitted use only if the standards of the middle-class reformers in charge were met. This placed the worker back into a role dictated by the values of middle-class property owners, orderliness, and docility. The inherent conflict embedded in this vision did not, however, prevent Germans from embracing the Schrebergarten, turning these allotment gardens into an important cultural institution and a strategy in shaping and maintaining Germanness. And 3/4 of a century later, after their founding in the 1860s, the gardens continued to be used to maintain a very particular kind of Germanness. In 1938, the family-run Trowitz und Sohn published a booklet, Reisgeld für Kleingärten, or Reich money for Kleingarten, a detailed explanation of the provisions for the promotion of allotment gardens by Wilhelm Gisberts, minister to the Third Reich's Ministry of Labor. In this promotion of allotment gardens, often interchangeably, as I've said, called Schrebergarten and Kleingarten, Gisberts highlights the importance of gardening for Germans and outlines both how the Reich should support gardeners and how the gardeners should, quote, suitably garden the allotment. Under planning of the garden, the booklet states simply that gardens have to fit the overall picture well and be functional, durable, and cheap. But the booklet provides no description of how the gardens must fit the overall picture, or indeed no description of the overall picture. Neither is there an explanation of what the Ministry of Labor meant by functional. What Gisberts does make sure to outline was who was to be accepted into the Kleingartenvereine, the associations. He writes, from the number of suitable candidates, all respectable national comrades who, like their wives, are German nationals, German blood, or blood of a similar kind, are politically and hereditarily reliable and can be selected. Gisberts' words suggest that the Schrebergarten played an important part in the Nazi project of building a racially pure society. In fact, the Schrebergarten acts as a microcosm that allows one to explore different forces that shaped the German cultural and social landscapes during the Nazi regime, and to understand how National Socialists shaped the urban spaces of the nation's cities to assert their political power. Art historian W.J.T. Mitchell expands on the relationship between man and environment in his own Landscape and Power. Quote, landscape is a physical and multisensory medium, earth, stone, vegetation, water, sky, sound and silence, light and darkness, and so on, in which cultural meanings and values are encoded. Mitchell further argues that landscapes such as Schrebergarten function as what Marx calls social hieroglyphs, symbolizing social relations that it conceals. The act of transforming a landscape, then, is always an act of writing into and over landscapes' existing relationships of power. Related to this discussion is the theory of spatial politics, which investigates how spaces are constructed and by whom. This theory examines how constructions may create new or reinforce existing social inequalities or injustices by limiting access to certain populations or creating certain meanings within those spaces, emphasizing the status of one group over another, or projecting social messages onto a specific group. Control of Schrebergarten by the National Socialists, whose interest in the spaces started as early as 1923, explicitly politicized urban space by stressing that it was created by and for racially pure citizens, becoming simultaneously a space where these citizens underwent political indoctrination and expressed their political loyalty. Such early Nazi interest in Schrebergarten suggested that they saw it as an important instrument of solidifying German identity in historic moments characterized by lack of unity. The National Socialists emerged out of a nationalist, racist, and populist paramilitary culture, offering workers an alternative to communist and socialist powers that proved incapable of addressing their economic and political concerns or of healing the trauma of war and the German Revolution. The National Socialists offered instead a folkish nationalism. Though folk has no direct English translation, it corresponds generally to a folk or ethnic group, imbued with overtones of the nation, race, and tribe. Folkish, therefore, has been rendered to mean a movement that was ethno-nationalistic or racially nationalistic. The impulse of the Nazi Party was to turn back to German soil and tradition, celebrating a German culture that was threatened by the spread of communism and increase of non-nationals and fears of German life. To combat the influence of these dangerous international forces, the Nazi Party imbued propaganda and public space with historical symbols of the German nation. Nazi politicization of spaces heavily relied on aesthetics, reflecting Hitler's belief that the ultimate objective of political effort should be artistic achievement. Hitler believed that politics should not be focused solely on international relations, but should aim to establish and defend a higher culture at home. Hitler pursued this objective by creating a new style of politics, one mediated through symbols, myths, rites, spectacles, and personal dramatics, in order to transform the German folk from spectators into participants in the National Socialist theater. Certainly, propaganda played an important part in communicating Nazi messages to a literate public, but so did the process of the creation of new and the restructuring of historic spaces. While much of Nazi architecture features neoclassic images that evoke modernity, masculinity, and civic duty, promoting the ideals of a public institutional identity, part of the Nazi Gleichschaltung included turning to medieval monuments to legitimize the rise to power of the Nazi Party and emphasize a return to the soil of an older German dynastic culture. The Gleichschaltung, literally putting into the same gear, was the Nazis' attempt to shape and influence all elements of German life. The process of urgent purging of the civil service, the abolition of the Weimar Party system, the dissolution of the state governments, as well as the wholesale reconstruction of German civic, associational, and even recreational life. In its goal to restructure German life, Gleichschaltung naturally meant restructuring the spaces in which Germans lived and interacted with one another. Urban planning of the Third Reich, therefore, was driven by the desire to return to this golden age of German culture, the so-called golden age of German culture, while simultaneously shaped by the Nazi attempt to build a new society. The Schrebergarten captures both impulses. The bourgeoisie of the 19th century clearly saw the possibility of creating a unified German body through spatial control, a body that could be persuaded to fight for the German land and a unified nation. Creating a unified nation was also the ultimate goal of the Nazis' Gleichschaltung project. Hence, the party included an already highly regulated space into their project. As communities of lower class workers, Schrebergarten colonies were often left-leaning politically, making it more urgent for the Nazis to take over the space and project their own messages into it. Nazification of Schrebergarten began in 1933 after the appointment of Hitler as Reich Chancellor. In Mein Kampf, Hitler emphasizes that the raising of, quote, totally sound bodies was the first concern of the National Socialist education, and the Schrebergarten had long been an institution based on creating upstanding German citizens. A 1909 pamphlet published in Leipzig titled Arbeitergärten, Schrebergärten, or Worker Gardens and Schrebergärten, begins with a summary of the goals of garden associations organized by middle-class reformers for urban working-class families and highlights this goal. Schrebergärten were meant to provide, quote, physical recovery of the worker and his family in healthy air after daily work in the workshop, and etc., and on Sunday. Strengthen, quote, old and disabled persons, convalescents, healed and improved lung patients by engaging in gardening, distract workers from visiting taverns, thereby improving their economic situation and increasing satisfaction with life, and strengthen the sense of family life through joint work and recreation by moving children from the large tenements, the dusty streets, the dark courtyards, to the flower-decorated garden home. The National Socialists based their own policy on these same goals, as their Gleichschaltung was an ordering and controlling of which bodies were supposed to participate in German civic life, and how they were supposed to behave. In the first issue of the journal Special News of the Reich Federation of Kleingärtner of Germany, and then a very long German name, Reichsbundes der Kleingärtner und Kleinsiedler Deutschlands, leader Hans Kaiser, later SS Obergruppenführer and general of the Waffen-SS, wrote that there would be, quote, special attention devoted to the Schrebergarten, and the Vereine would be, quote, reorganized in the national social sense. Schrebergarten thus became a focus of the Nazi Gleichschaltung. The focus of the Volksgesundheitsbewegung, or public health movement, under the National Socialists was based on health education, care, and welfare while promoting a healthy lifestyle through preventative care of health, outdoor life, and the fight against the customary use of pleasure poisons, or alcohol. In 1933, Hans Kammler wrote that the, quote, ideas of the National Socialists regarding population and race policies must be introduced into the circle of allotment gardeners in order to combat the damaging influence of the city to which these gardeners were exposed. For Kammler and the National Socialists, one of the cures to the damages of the city was a deeper connection to nature. This turn to nature was not an innovation of the National Socialists, of course. German thinkers of the 19th century emphasized a historical connection between German culture and agrarian landscape, romanticizing an agrarian landscape that they juxtaposed to cities, which were seen as unnatural entities without organic stability. 19th century philosophers urged the bourgeoisie to abandon the immorality of the city and return to the wellspring of social and cultural health in agriculture. Threatened by this unnatural entity that was the modern city, the German middle class reappropriated the countryside through natural activities such as hiking, infusing the national landscape with their own meanings. Back to nature organizations such as the Wandervogel movement encouraged shaking off the restrictions of a modern consumerist society and returning to an agrarian landscape of freedom and moral purity, and through that getting in touch with their national spirit. The Nazis embraced the back to nature German tradition in the way they regulated city plans and connected them to agrarian land, and in the way, of course, that they organized Hitler youth activities, or any youth activities. For the Nazis, the Schrebergarten became a central focus of their program to reform the soil of Germany and to imbue it with nationalist meaning. Quote, to secure the future of the nation with the plow. In his Reichsgeld for Kleingärten, Gisberts notes that there is, quote, great political importance attached to the working of the garden, and that beautiful gardens can be found everywhere, adjacent to industrial plants, residential areas, and other green spaces. Schrebergartenvereine were filled with, quote, Germans of Aryan descent, who would cause no anti-national agitation. All leading members of Vereine were immediately dismissed and replaced by members of the National Socialist Party. Once under the control of National Socialist members, the Nazis politicized the space with their own ideologies. Most important to the Nazi Gleichschaltung was emphasizing the connection between the German folk and the German land based on Hitler's Blut und Boden, or blood and soil ideology. Nazi events hosted in Schrebergarten colonies display the emphasis of this connection. A 1936 exhibition of the Reichsbund der Kleingärtner und Kleinsiedler Deutschlands was titled Ohne Bauernblut kein deutsches Volk, or No German Folk Without Peasant Blood. As urban allotment gardens, Schrebergärten were not occupied by peasants, but industrial workers, of course, but hosting exhibitions on agrarian landscape in urban Schrebervereine and using language that emphasized a feudal past, restructured urban green spaces into an agrarian landscape. This move directly connected working class gardeners to their agrarian roots, tying the gardeners to the German land. Peasants had long been the perceived carriers of German virtues, hard work, independence, and love for the fatherland. It was these virtues that the urban agrarian spaces were to instill in the minds of the working classes while disciplining their bodies through agrarian work. Unlike their approach in restructuring other physical spaces in their Gleichschaltung process, the National Socialists did not actually reorganize the structure of most existing Schrebervereine, since Schrebergärten were already highly regulated and standardized spaces. One of the main guiding principles of design was to prevent gardeners from individualizing their gardens. Segments for fruit, vegetables, and so on were still to be carefully measured out and tended, and each garden was to be lined with flower beds and bushes, emphasizing an aestheticism, suggesting that the gardens were still not spaces simply for subsistence farming, but were a true Eden. And Schrebergarten colonies were just as structured as individual plots. Though the size of those gardens varied, they were all evenly arranged and all of a standard quadrangle shape. Gardens in the colony were all built around a communal space not much bigger than any individual gardens. The central location of the communal space, the location of most headquarters of Vereine, allowed Vereine leaders, as before, to observe and control the activities within the short standardized cuts all around. Of course, for the working class gardeners, the gardens were spaces for subsistence farming, spaces that they relied on to survive, and the Nazis took advantage of workers' reliance on their gardens. Hans Kammler, first leader of the Reichsbundes der Kleingärten und Kleinsiedler Deutschlands, under the National Socialists, may have been inspired by these regulated, standardized plans when he went on to design the Third Reich's major concentration camps. His work earned him the title Architect of Death. For the Nazis, the control of land directly correlated to the political control of bodies. But the National Socialists controlled more than just how the land in Schrebergarten could be arranged. They also controlled the aesthetics of the structures on the land. The huts on Schrebergarten plots featured traditional Bavarian elements, including half timbering and detailed lattice work. These features stood in stark contrast to the concrete and metal industrial cityscapes that the workers inhabited every day. Beyond the aesthetics of the garden houses, gardeners often had Gartensberg in their allotments, figures we call garden gnomes in English. Gnomes were first popularized in the 19th century when created by sculptor Philipp Griebel and represented the fairy tale history of medieval Germany. It became popular once again in the 1930s as the Nazis reached for their historical roots. The font of Vereine signs too was historicized. Where images of signs from the 1910s and 1920s, as on the left, features Jugendstil font, gardens under the Nazis suddenly favored medieval font. This decision to choose medieval font over modern Jugendstil font was a rejection of the modernist movements that the National Socialists saw as a threat to German nationalism. Such features transported the gardener from their urban industrial neighborhood to a romantic past. But Nazi support of such historical and bourgeois features was not simply an attempt to help workers forget the struggle of their urban lives. Hitler did, after all, emphasize the importance of aestheticism in delivering political messages. For Hitler and the National Socialists, Bavarian features were more than simply aesthetically pleasing. They were powerful elements of the Nazi identity. It was in the beer halls of Munich that the National Socialist Party was born, after all, and the party based their headquarters in the same city. The party powerfully identified with the architecture and history of the region and endlessly tried to place themselves as a continuation of its medieval history. The connection to Bavarian history is featured in the infamous 1935 propaganda film, Triumph of the Will. In it, Riefenstahl places the audience in medieval Nuremberg, not only to celebrate the Führer's political triumph, but simultaneously to celebrate the glory and accomplishments of pre-Weimar Germany, stressing its racial purity as she represents a German without ethnic minorities, an Aryan German. By directly placing the audience amongst Nuremberg's medieval monuments and buildings, she is engaging the audience's emotions, tying them to a lost Germanic era of romance and power, and suggesting the source of its renewal. This national power and renewal were projected onto the worker gardeners of Schrebergarten in events sponsored by the National Socialists through the Reichsbundes der Kleingärtner und Kleinsiedler Deutschlands, the organization of worker gardeners. Luncheons, Kleingärtner Tage, small garden days, and political rallies were all held in Schrebergarten colonies, politicizing the green space. Such events represented the new politics Hitler embraced, one based on rights, spectacles, and personal dramatics, to transform the German folk from spectators into participants in the National Socialist theater. Rallies turned gardens from rented plots for independent subsistence farming into public spaces meant to deliver messages of nationalism and fascism. Under the National Socialists, gardening thus was turned into a nationalist activity meant to support the party and shape the Weltanschauung of its members, or the worldview of its members. Through standardizing the appearance of the allotments and controlling the communal activities allowed within the gardens, the Third Reich reinforced a historical connection to the German land and forced the working class families to inhabit idealized agrarian spaces. Thus, through Blut und Boden, the German workers in Schrebergarten fulfilled the role of the German folk. And now a bit of a The paradoxes of the Schreberverein in its inception and under the Nazis, however, did not prevent Germans from embracing the Schrebergarten after the war. But in a divided Germany, the gardens began to take on new meanings. In a post-war world, the roles of Schrebergarten for German citizens depended largely on their geographical location, while the gardeners' relationships to their allotments reflected their economic status. For West Germans, the Schrebergarten became a haven in the post-war economic boom. Gardens were less about subsistence farming now, as the prosperous years of the 1960s and 70s and the reintegration of European and global food markets eroded German interest in Schrebergarten for producing food. Instead, these spaces became leisure gardens. This movement was typical of post-war West German cities as gardening became a central element of popular culture. In 1951, the Federal Republic of Germany established a Kleingärtnertag, or Allotment Gardener Day, on which Gartenvereine held festivals and festivities for their tenants. In Lower Saxony, the Kleingärtnertag marked the opening of the Niedersächsischen Kleingärtnerwoche, or the Lower Saxony Allotment Gardener Week. Cities issued Kleingärtnerjahrbuche, gardener yearbooks, to commemorate these festivities and to display the successes of individual Schrebervereine. For West Germans, garden became centers of social engagement and community building, helping the nation recover from the trauma of the Second World War. In socialist East Germany, however, the gardens retain a distinctly survivalist tone. Gardens served as a relief to the catastrophic living conditions of the inner cities. Besides providing an escape from oppressively monotonous Soviet-style housing, Schrebergarten also allowed East Germans to supplement their limited diets made up of food rations that many struggled to survive on. But beyond the acutely different reasons that motivated gardeners in East and West Germany to turn to their Schrebergarten, the cultural elements of gardens in the German Democratic Republic were influenced by the state's politics. The Schrebergarten culture blended with the similar Russian tradition of dachas, and the spaces were called the Germanized Russian name dache. As land in the GDR was not privately owned, great fields allowed the state to establish an estimated 3.4 million dachas throughout East Germany. Despite the number, however, gardens were hard to come by and demand was high. For those who did have gardens, they felt they had at least a little freedom in a space where they could meet with friends and find a sense of peace. Significantly, by the late 1980s, the book with the highest sales in the GDR was a guide on gardening. The ongoing contemporary importance of the gardens can be seen in news articles about new and diverse communities in the spaces. And there is even a Bundeskleingartengesetz, or Federal Allotment Garden Act, which regulates all manner of activities within the fences of the allowed 400 square meter allotment. The act keeps rents low at an average of only €1 a day and stipulates that tracts may only be used for non-commercial use. Allotment huts cannot be bigger than 24 square meters, including the terrace, and living within them is strictly verboten. As technologies changed through the latter half of the 20th century, so too did the rules of Schrebervereine. Now all colonies have prescribed quiet time, or Ruhezeit, during which time gardeners are forbidden from mowing their lawns, using any other form of motorized equipment, and playing loud music. The Ruhe regulations are typically enforced between 1 and 3 and after 6 to allow for proper rest and relaxation in the urban Eden. But this is only one rule of the dozens outlined in the Bundeskleingartengesetz, the allotment garden law, that regulates all manner of activities within the fence of the 400 square meter allotment. While these regulations are established for all gardeners to follow, stories point to some families facing harsher criticism than others. Immigrants are frequently criticized for failing to follow Bundeskleingartengesetz regulations. Exclusion does not only affect aspiring Turkish gardeners, as I mentioned in my introduction. Eastern European gardeners have also encountered cultural resistance. Immigrants such as the Russian-born German short story writer Vladimir Kaminer continue to have experiences in Schrebergarten that influence their interaction with German culture. In the summer of 2018, I interviewed Kaminer in Berlin outside a cafe in the square am Falkplatz. Across the street, we could see the Mauerpark, so named for the Berlin Wall that used to run through it. It was the fall of the Berlin Wall that brought Kaminer to Berlin. Kaminer grew up, as he says, on the asphalt of Moscow. Seeing gardens within a major metropolis such as Berlin was new and exciting for him. Immediately upon moving to the metropolis, Kaminer and his wife, Olga, applied for a Schrebergarten. By chance, an elderly neighbor was giving up his garden and the Kaminers were lucky enough to inherit it. But their Eden did not last long. They were kicked out of the Vereine for, quote, spontaneous vegetation. How I interpret this is that they were kicked out for weeds. Kaminer expanded on this in his novel, Mein Leben im Schrebergarten, My Life in a Schrebergarten. The Kaminers had been issued a citation for failing to meet the strict regulations of their colony, ironically called Glückliche Hütten, or happy huts, regarding tidiness. For Russians, Kaminer writes, gardens should have a little chaos, but this vision stood in stark contrast to the German view of gardens. In our conversation, Kaminer explained that he believes he was kicked out because Germans have, quote, a constant urge to be the best in the world and always want the world to look like them. But, Kaminer says, through their failure in the world wars, Germans feel that they are being laughed at and that no one will respect them. To regain some control and dignity, Kaminer explains, the Germans decided that since, quote, the whole world wouldn't listen to them, they would take a small piece of the world, very small, but there they would have complete control. The Schrebergarten is German-invented Weltgeist, an idealized world designed in miniature. It is a German paradise where you aren't allowed to sleep. It is an Eden for Adam and Eve, but only where Adam and Eve have to leave in the evenings and come back in the mornings. His interpretation of the gardens. For Russians, gardens are not seen as a project, but are the essence of existence and the lifebelt of Russianness. The notion that gardens should be regulated is completely foreign for Russians and would never work in Russia, Kaminer says. Kaminer believes Russians are much more rational with how they use their gardens. Their goal is to harvest food and nothing more. Whether or not weeds grow amongst their vegetables is of no concern to the Russian gardener. But for the Kaminers, their weeds and glückliche Hüten led to their exile from Eden. While Kaminer finds himself restricted by the laughable German regulations, German gardeners find immigrant gardening practices an act of resistance towards integration. Just days after my interview with Kaminer, I interviewed Bert, a native German who co-rents a garden in Kolonie Sonnenbad, the sunbathing colony, in Friedenau, directly by Flugkreuz in Berlin, the second largest train station in Berlin. While Bert celebrated the benefits of gardening for all, relaxation, healthy food, and a connection to nature, he said, he spoke too to the frustrations he felt towards Turkish immigrants in this colony. Quote, even after 30 years of living in Germany, they have not integrated. There are so many here, but they do not integrate. The gardens provide us with a unique way to understand the negotiation amongst immigrants between two parallel processes: spatial and cultural integration, and the desire to preserve ethnic identities. Gardens serve as sites where these processes occur simultaneously as immigrants bring their gardening practices, such as planting techniques and choice of plants, while also implementing and adjusting to the existing German practices in the spaces, all framed through culturally specific social relations. Examining these practices can help us understand how communities and individuals create identities in new environments, an understanding that can help diverse communities live more harmoniously in a globalizing world. But exploring the tensions within the gardens too can help us recognize the failures and difficulties of modern integration practices. Frequently, efforts to understand failures and successes of immigration look only at policies and episodes of major, perhaps violent conflicts. More attention should be paid too to daily negotiations within immigrant communities, among different generations of immigrants, for example, and outside of their communities with neighbors. I argue that the gardens can act as a lens through which the historian can look to understand the roots, excuse my pun, of many of these tensions. The modern tensions between immigrant and native gardener proves that the garden can reveal the complexity of modern cultural integration in Germany. Today, Schrebergarten are often called spießig, a term used interchangeably to mean bourgeois and suburban, perhaps as a nod to the paradoxical history. The definition is curiously specific, but it manages to capture the dynamic history of these German allotment gardens. In 2002, the nonprofit art and culture organization Kabinett wrote, Schrebergardens are folk cultural remnants of a long, contradictory, and multi-layered social history in which one finds almost every movement, error, and aberration in German history. Vladimir Kaminer, Bert, and the Turkish immigrants certainly aren't alone in their desire to garden in a Schreberverein. The gardens have become so influential in Germany that Schreber's name has even become a verb, used as a synonym for gardening, Schrebern. And thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation, but I will include a little slide here about myself, my current project. I'm, as Pippa mentioned, a PhD student at the University of York, and I am working on a project I've called Redefining Yorkness, looking at York's migrant heritage. And this is I'm doing this in collaboration with the York Civic Trust, and this is funded by the White Rose College of Arts and Humanities. It's largely an oral history project, and I'm hoping to add a co-production piece into it, so to create some kind of product with migrant communities in York who I've become involved with, and who have begun interviewing. So a bit of a shift away from the gardens, but hopefully not too far away. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Daria. That's just fascinating. The weaving of it's a real insight into politics, power, and gardens from the inception, and some of it fairly horrifying. Starting with Dr. Schreber's devices, which unbelievable now, isn't it? I wonder what he'd think of where the movement had gone to. I'm just going to check. Please, people, write your questions in the chat box. Have you got any idea of how many Schrebergarten are held by migrants? Is there any way of measuring that?
I don't know. I mean, I think it would be a very hard thing to measure. You would basically have to approach every colony across the country, and they do keep very good documents. They're participants in the gardens and kind of who is renting a garden when and where is generally quite well documented. I will say that, but there's really no work on migrants in these spaces yet. So unfortunately, this was one of my goals when I was doing my master's at Oxford, was to go to Germany and continue doing oral history interviews. I really only got 2 when I was there several years ago. Yeah. But the pandemic interrupted that plan. So when I'm done with this project, my migrants in New York, I'm hoping to go back to my migrants in Germany and collect more interviews.
It would be very interesting.
Yeah.
So the Vereine are made up of, I mean, is it publicly owned or publicly appointed people who run the Vereine?
No, they well, they're technically public spaces, but they are run by kind of a private organization. So it's a bit of a confusing combination. So kind of both, but they each individually have their own rules, but then they do have to meet the federal regulations that dictate all of them. So yeah, it's an interesting space, and the challenge of kind of writing about these spaces in general is that they're private, but they're public. I mean, they're not really private because people are renting these gardens, but they have some agency and some ownership over them, but they have to meet all these regulations. So this was one of the great challenges of writing about them, is just not knowing how to place them, or define them.
So we have to have some questions here. Let me just start at the top. There we go. So Michael Ann's asking, is there another type of allotment and garden in Germany that's grown up for people who don't fit the Schrebergarten type of person?
Yeah, there are other, I mean, not all allotment gardens are called Schrebergarten. So some have different titles and don't necessarily follow his, well, not that they really follow Schreber's philosophy anymore, but they don't really align themselves with Schreber. So there are just general Kleingärten or allotments. But there's also a really great and exciting growing field, I guess you could say, of community spaces, of community gardens. So in Germany, in Berlin, for example, there are numerous gardens now where people can garden alongside one another, and they're not as highly regulated. And the beautiful thing about Berlin, I mean, the tragic thing about Berlin is that so much of the city was destroyed or changed over the past century. But it has meant that a lot of these spaces that have previously been abandoned are now being kind of repurposed for green space, for community gardens. So there's certainly a shift away from the private public allotment garden, more towards a community garden.
With less regulation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Lynn asks, in the UK, industrialization was also reacted to by a desire for nature, for example, Ruskin. So how far do you think the poets of the New Germany, who were scientists, influenced the direction of this evolution? And she gives Goethe as an example.
It's a really good question. I mean, I can't say I could give a firm example or a firm explanation of how far. I think that I think the idea of returning to nature was just really pivotal in Germany in this kind of industrialization, as you say. And I think it's created this connection to nature that the Germans have held on to, and the English, I think, similarly have held on to this connection to nature through hiking groups and so on and so forth. Yeah, I'm not really sure that I could say how far the poets went. I'm not a poet. I don't read much poetry, so I don't have the literary background there. But the desire and the connection to nature really colors German identity throughout the 20th century, and still does, I think.
Thank you. There's a question for Sarah Skopje. Thank you for this amazing talk. As a German who's always been very suspicious of the Schrebergarten movement and the Spießertum, so intrinsically linked to it, I have learned so many new things about the history of the Schrebergarten.
I'm so glad to hear. I'm glad that I can teach German somehow.
Jeremy Newton asks, he comments, interesting how damaged some of Schreber's children were by the parental education practices.
Yes, that's actually quite a story, that his own son was, I mean, it's not a surprise when you think of how toxic, I guess, in the modern sense you could call him his parenting style. But yeah, his own children were very had a lot of psychological challenges throughout their lives, so which is tragic to learn. And yet he presents himself as this expert on children's education and creating, you know, this upstanding German character, whatever that means. Yeah.
Did they have a garden?
Well, no, I mean, I think he took his children out to green spaces, but the Schrebergarten in its kind of the form that it now has and that it held in the later 19th century didn't really exist until after he died. And these kind of public playgrounds didn't really exist until several years after his death. So yeah, not quite.
Lynn's come back with another one. And how secure are the community gardens? Are they formalized or sort of squatters?
They're quite formalized, actually. And I should have included an image of, I mean, it's all gated, but you can walk through. And one of the challenges of this research is that when you go into these spaces, people are there to relax and garden, and they don't necessarily want to talk to some researcher looking at the history of gardens. So I could enter these spaces, even though there were gates, you could walk through. But people are quite private and reserved in those spaces. And yeah, there's certainly not any kind of squatter space. They are quite formalized and quite regulated. As I mentioned, there were these central spaces, these central Vereine plots where the kind of the Vereine, the association, met and organized. There would be a building, and those still exist. There's still like a space where you have to meet the regulations and you have to come and check in with them basically, and they do kind of sweeps of the garden and see that everything is. That's why Vladimir Kaminer got kicked out, because of these spontaneous vegetation. He didn't his garden wasn't neat enough. So yeah, they're still quite formalized.
That's a nice take. Another question from Sarah. You do definitely get a suspicious look when you walk or jog through one of these Schrebergarten estates, despite the public right of way.
Absolutely. I mean, I've tried to approach several gardeners when I was there in 2018, just to have a chat, not necessarily a formal interview, just to kind of, hear, how long have you been gardening here? Why do you like to garden? So on and so forth. And they say, well, we're not interested, we're busy, and just kind of turn you away. So it's a strange feeling, because a green space feels like somewhere where you can relax and get create a sense of community with one another and share your love for green spaces. But actually people are quite private, which I do respect, but it goes against my idea of what a garden should be. But that's just personal.
Okay, so there's Lynn comments that you do receive a dirty plot letter in the UK if
Okay,
you're wandering down the Camino way.
yes, yes.
There's a thank you from Mary Sewell. I don't know if anybody else has got some questions. Do please put them in, but perhaps could I just ask one more?
Please. Yeah.
Is there, have you done any work on the sorts of gardens that these migrants want? What culture they're bringing with them to this? For instance, I think there are allotment gardens in Istanbul, for instance. Is there any? Do you get any sense of what they want to achieve in the German Schrebergarten?
That's a great point that you mentioned. There are indeed lots of gardens in Istanbul, and extremely old ones. I mean, there are certain garden plots, allotments that have been there since the Ottomans. So, you know, they have a very old and long-lasting and important cultural tradition of gardening. And I think from my, brief discussions with immigrants in Germany and in the UK, and being an immigrant myself and knowing a lot of immigrants, having friends who are immigrants, I think the idea of community is very central to gardening. And it goes with, how I felt going into these spaces. I was excited to talk to people about gardening, saying, oh, I love to garden. What do you plant? What do you grow? Why do you choose to grow that? How long have you been here? And that's what I find a lot of Turkish and Russian immigrants similarly feel. They want to share this space as somewhere to, share stories and share food. And it's all about kind of, I mean, this is such a pun, but growing together, right? Whereas Germans want to, this is a generalization, but the Germans in Schrebergarten want to kind of control their space and have their privacy. So I think community gardens are perhaps more along the lines of how Russian or Turkish migrants might want to use these spaces. Obviously, it depends on the family and the individual. But yeah, using these spaces as a place of community and connection. And a lot of these articles about modern kind of movement into these spaces by migrant communities, people complain about the noise, or that all these immigrants are constantly grilling and playing music and dancing, and it's about recreation and not just about growing your plants and relaxing in your own solitude. So yeah, a big contradictory, or quite a tension between the two ideas.
We have two more questions. One is from Jeremy Newton again. Was there any change in the spatial politics of gardens during the Weimar Republic?
That is a great question. And I will admit that one of the challenges in my research is that a lot of the sources I found, and this is why I wrote about the Nazis so extensively, is that there was so much written about. I mean, it's horrible, but because they were so committed to this project of the Schrebergarten, there was a lot written about the Schrebergarten by the Nazis, and then it kind of dropped off afterwards. But also beforehand, I think in Weimar Germany, there was certainly the culture was still there, but it wasn't quite as urgent a project for the Weimar Republic because they were kind of struggling to keep themselves afloat. And I will say too, as I mentioned in the paper very briefly, that there were a lot of communists in these spaces, so it was quite a left-leaning. Gardens became very left-leaning, and a lot of political movements kind of met together in gardens. So it is a really interesting story, and I really do want to continue working on Weimar Germany, but I don't have as much of a story there yet. So when I get back to the gardens after the PhD.
Thank you. Right, from John Eversley. Sorry, it's just interesting that the 20th century English allotment movement owes much to an American of German origin, Joseph Weiss, who also paid for Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, etc. to come to London in 1907 for a conference.
I do not know that story. I will maybe I should be working on English allotment gardens now. That's really fascinating. I'll have to look that up. Thank you for sharing.
Michael Ann, do you find any resemblance between UK allotments and the Schrebergartens?
I I really enjoy, so I will say that walking to the main campus here in York, if I walk to the university, I have to walk through an allotment, and you know, an allotment colony, I guess you would call it, or the Germans would call it. And I really enjoy kind of peering in, and it feels much more relaxed than if you walk through a German allotment colony. I think, you know, it is a right of way. People are expecting you to walk through. And also they are not quite as regulated, or for like, there's not as much of a, they're not quite as formal. The German allotments have the hut, they all have a hut, and it has to be exactly this big, you know, 24 square meters, and they have to have flowers and they have to have a fruit tree. So there's a lot more, there's a certain look to allotment gardens in Germany, and I wish I had put more pictures of them, but they all also really are dedicated to these Gartenzwerg, the garden gnomes. So they kind of decorate the spaces too. So it becomes not just about the flowers and fruits, but also about kind of making it your own. And there's a lot of flags. So I'll go back to this one image. You know, they really like to express themselves, like their sports teams, or they have the German flag flying, or the Turkish flag, or whatever it might be, but they're much more they're kind of more built up. They look less like a garden and more like a, I don't know, a small estate. But I prefer the English garden because it feels more wild and free, much more romantic. But yeah, that's the difference, I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have some questions to put? Yeah, sorry.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
they keep moving. Right. From Howard Bristol. It seems like Schrebergarten are much more about green open space than the allotment movement in the UK, which feels more strongly about productive gardening. Is that changing at all? And how is wildlife friendly gardening being taken up in the former Schrebergarten? He's also interested to know if you would want a Schrebergarten if you could.
This is the question I ask myself every day. No, I think, I think it's interesting in Germany that there is certainly a productive element to gardening, but I think you're right in saying that the English garden is more about, I mean, it's about gardening and growing your beans and growing your potatoes or whatever it is. But in Germany, it is kind of this Eden. A lot of texts mention this idea of the Eden, of having your own space to relax. So I think that's a right way to put it, that it's more about like being in touch with the green space and growing your flowers rather than growing your potatoes and whatnot. And I think that's also one of the tensions that native German gardeners and immigrant gardeners experience, that immigrants are there to, you know, grow all the herbs that they miss from their homeland, and to kind of communicate and have this social space. But for the Germans, it's more about relaxing. So I think that, I hope that answers your question. There's also, so the wildlife friendly gardening. Yeah, I think there used to be quite there was a history of that people would rear pigs and chickens in their gardens. And I honestly don't know if that still exists. I think this was when the gardens were more for subsistence farming in these moments of, you know, national crises. And as the gardens were first created in the 19th century. But so I don't know if there are, certainly when I was in Berlin, I didn't see many chickens running around. So if I would want a Schrebergarten, I mean, I wouldn't turn one down, but I think there's other forms of gardening that I would prefer. So yeah.
There are two comments from Sarah really relating to the same thing. As a German who's lived in the UK for 7 years, I'd say the English allotment garden and the Schrebergarten couldn't be more different. And then she goes on to say, and wildlife has no place in a Schrebergarten, sadly. Wild animals are replaced by gnomes.
Yes, replaced by gnomes. I think that's as wild as you can get.
Lynn just makes a comment that there was a very good film in 2007 called Grow Your Own, about refugees being given plots in an allotment in Liverpool and growing together.
Wonderful. I'm going to look that up.
Olivia Colman was the star in that, I think.
Oh, wonderful. Lovely.
again, John Eversley says that some of the allotments in York and the university side are the result of Quaker influence.
Yes, that's true. I'm familiar with that. The Quakers have a huge influence in York and the development of Cadbury's. Well, Cadbury's was not in York, but of Terry's and of Roundtree's. Those were all the Quakers too. So yeah, they have quite a influence on the city. Yeah.
Max Caligula says there are lots of similarities between Italian and English allotment gardens, but the German ones are thoroughly different. Just a thought to contribute.
That's really interesting. I have not looked at the Italian gardens at all, but maybe after this PhD, I'll do German. I'll finish the German, then I'll move on to the English and Italian. I need to work on my Italian though.
That's just a challenge.
Yes.
Does anybody else have a question? We will wrap up in a minute. But if anybody would like to stay for an informal chat with Daria, they're very welcome. But in the meantime, I shall thank everybody for coming. Just remind you that on February the 9th, Anna Toledano from Stanford University will be talking about Forgotten Botany, the politics of knowledge within the Royal Botanical Garden of New Spain, which will be a whole different aspect for our program. And thanks for a really interesting paper.